Hello, my friend. Welcome to the long quiet. Tonight you are an aging bookseller closing up your small shop on a rainy October evening in Vermont in 1978. By a little after 6 o'clock, the rain had been falling for most of the afternoon, and Walter was beginning to think about closing up the shop. The shop was called Hollis Books, and it had been called Hollis Books for 31 years, since the autumn of 1947, when Walter had taken the lease from a man named Pemberton, who had wanted to retire to Florida. Walter had been 31 years old at the time. He had used most of his savings on the lease, and on the first 6 months of stock, and he had spent the first winter of the shop in a state of low, quiet fear that he had made a serious mistake. The mistake had not materialized. The shop had stayed. 31 years had gone by. He had not gone to Florida and had not, on most days, considered going. He was 62 years old now. He was a tall, thin man, slightly stooped at the shoulders in the way men get, who have spent a lifetime leaning toward the lower shelves of bookcases. And he wore, in October, a heavy gray wool cardigan over a white shirt and a thin navy tie. The cardigan had been a gift from a woman he had known many years ago in Boston. The woman had moved to Connecticut and married a dentist. The cardigan remained. He had washed it many times. It still held its shape. The town in which the shop stood was a small Vermont town. The kind of town that had a single main street and a small green at the south end of it with a Civil War monument, and a white wooden bandstand that no one had used in his memory. The town had perhaps 1,100 people in it. Walter knew most of them by sight, and a smaller number by name, and a smaller number still as friends. He had become, in 31 years, the bookman of the town. And this was, for him, a satisfactory thing to have become. The shop had 4 rooms. The front room was where the new arrivals went. Behind the front room was the larger middle room, which held most of the general inventory, broken down into the usual sections. And behind the middle room was the back room, which was the section for the older and finer books. Glassed-in cases along the walls, a small Persian rug on the floor, a single deep armchair, and a green-shaded brass library lamp on a small desk, where Walter sat when he was cataloging. Off the back room, there was a small kitchen with a counter and a sink, and a hot plate, and a glass front cabinet of mismatched cups, where he made tea for himself and sometimes for customers who had become friends. Upstairs, accessed by a narrow door at the back of the kitchen, was Walter's apartment. He had lived there for the full 31 years. The rain had been a long, quiet rain. It had begun around 2 o'clock as a kind of soft thickening of the air, and had become, by 3, an honest, steady October rain. The kind that comes down in even gray curtains and asks nothing of anyone. The streets of the small Vermont town outside the shop window had gone slow in the way streets do in steady rain. The few cars that passed went slow. The few people on the sidewalks walked slow under their umbrellas. And the umbrellas, viewed from inside the shop through the rain-blurred glass, were small, dark, moving discs, going one way and another, in no particular hurry. Walter stood for a moment at the window and watched. He had a cup of tea in his hand. He had been drinking tea in his small, careful way since about 4. The cup was a thick, white china cup with a small chip in the rim that he had chipped himself in 1958 on the corner of the counter. The chip had become familiar. He drank. The shop had been quiet for most of the afternoon. A woman had come in around 3 to look for a cookbook for her daughter who was getting married in November. And Walter had spent the better part of half an hour with her, walking the cookery section, pulling down volumes for her to consider. She had settled at last on a clean copy of Beard's American Cookery, and one of Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And she had thanked him with that small particular warmth that people use when they have been helped without being hurried. And she had gone out into the rain with her 2 books in a brown paper bag, pressed to her chest under her coat. After that, no one had come for almost 2 hours. He had used the time. He had sat at the small desk in the back room and worked through the pile of letters from the dealers in Boston. A long letter from a man named Sturgis, who handled estate liquidations, and who had written to ask about a particular set of trollop that had come into his hands. Walter had written back to ask the condition of the bindings. He had set the letter on the corner of the desk to be mailed in the morning. He had drunk his tea. The bell above the front door rang once. He turned from the window. A man had come in, shaking the rain off a long brown raincoat. And the man was Henry Caulfield, who came into the shop every Friday at about this time to pick up whatever Walter had set aside for him during the week. Henry Caulfield was the high school history teacher in the next town over, a man of about 50, quiet, kind, with the small, attentive eyes of a man who had read a great deal and would read a great deal more. He had been coming to the shop since 1968, 10 years now, and he had become, in those 10 years, what Walter thought of as one of the small handful of true friends he had made through the shop, although they had never, in all that time, met outside it. "Walter," he said. "Henry." Henry hung his raincoat on the hook by the door. He stamped his rubbers once on the mat. He came forward into the shop. "You said you had something for me," he said. "Two things, actually. A nice copy of Mencken came in on Tuesday, and the Salinger I wrote to you about. The Salinger came. It came." Walter walked behind the counter and pulled from the small stack of held items he kept on the shelf below. 2 books wrapped in brown paper with Henry's name written on each in pencil. He set them on the counter. Henry approached, picked up the top one, unfolded the paper a small distance to see the cover, smiled and folded the paper back over the book. "How much?" he asked. "8 for the 2. Henry counted out $8 and laid the bills on the counter. Walter put them in the small wooden drawer beneath the register. They did not speak as he did this. There was no need to speak. It was a transaction they had done together perhaps 400 times. "How's the rain treating you?" Henry asked. "It's a fine rain. I think it's gonna come down all night." "I think so." Henry tucked the 2 books into the inside pocket of his raincoat, which he had brought down off the hook for the purpose, and he put the raincoat back on. He paused at the door. "Walter, you know, my brother is coming up from Hartford next weekend. He'll want to see the shop. He's welcome. He hasn't been up in a few years. I'd be glad to see him. I told him about your trollops. Walter smiled a very small smile, in the way he smiled at the long stretch of all the conversations he had had about books over the years. He should come. Good night, Walter. Good night, Henry. The bell rang as the door closed behind him. Walter stood at the counter for a moment after Henry was gone. The shop was, again, very quiet. The rain on the front window was a small, steady sound. The clock on the wall, an old wooden wall clock that had been in the shop since before Walter, ticked its slow tick. Somewhere in the middle room, a board settled with a small, soft pop, the way old buildings do when the temperature shifts. He drank the last of his tea. He set the cup on the counter. He looked for a moment at the long rows of shelves stretching back through the rooms of the shop. The shelves were dark wood, oak in some places and walnut in others. They had been built by a carpenter named Mortensen in 1936. Walter had inherited them. He had added a few more himself over the years, but the bones of the shop were Mortensen's bones. And Walter, looking at them, thought, as he sometimes did, that he was the temporary occupant of a stage that had been set long before him and would remain long after. He walked to the front door. He turned the small wooden sign that hung in the window from open to closed. He slid the bolt across. He drew down the small blind on the door's window, which he did not always do, but which he sometimes did on rainy nights when he did not want anyone to look in and see him moving about in the lamplight and feel encouraged to knock. The shop was now his. He stood in the front room for a long moment and let the small fact of having closed up settle around him. There was a kind of small daily ceremony in this, in the closing. It had not lost its quality in 31 years. The shop became, between 6 and 7 in the evening, a different shop than it was between 10 and 6. In the daytime, it was a public place. A place open to the small ringing of the bell and the small varied hours of customers. After 6, it was something else. It was his rooms. It was where he lived his evenings. He went then to the broom and dustpan that he kept in the corner behind the counter, and he began the slow, small sweep of the front room. He swept the way he always swept. He started at the front of the room and worked back, taking the small drift of grit that the day's customers had brought in on their shoes and pushing it in long, slow strokes toward the central aisle. There was not much to sweep. He had swept this morning, but the rain had brought a small new layer of grit. He had been a sweeper of this floor for 31 years. He knew its quirks. He knew the slightly low place in front of the new arrivals table where the bristles caught. He knew the small worn groove along the threshold of the doorway between the front room and the middle room, where his customers' feet had worn down the wood over time. He knew them the way a man knows the small geography of any place where he has spent the long inner hours of his life. He finished the front room. He moved into the middle room and swept it too. The middle room took longer. There were more shelves, more aisles, more small turnings of the floor. He went around the entire room. He stopped twice to bend down and pick up a fallen bookmark and a small scrap of receipt paper that had drifted under a shelf. He put them in the small wastebasket beside the counter. He moved into the back room. He did not sweep the back room. There was nothing to sweep. He had not had a customer in the back room since Tuesday afternoon. The Persian rug had been beaten on Sunday. The floor was clean. He brought the broom and dustpan back to their corner. He picked up his teacup from the counter and he carried it slowly through the middle room, through the back room, and into the small kitchen. He set the cup in the small porcelain sink. He would wash it later. He turned in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at the back room. The back room was, in the evening, his favorite room. It had the deep armchair and the desk with the green-shaded lamp and the glassed cases of the finer books along the wall. It had the small Persian rug, faded and warm, that he had bought at an estate sale in 1962 in a town further north. It had a small wood-burning stove in the corner, an old enamel stove that he had had cleaned and serviced for so many seasons that the man who came to service it, a fellow named Robideau, had become a friend, and they had talked over the years about many things besides stoves. Walter went to the stove. He opened the small grate. There were already a few embers from earlier in the afternoon. He fed them. A small piece of birch first, then a split of pine. The fire took in its small, careful way. He closed the grate. He stood for a moment with his hands held just above the iron top of the stove, feeling the warmth begin to rise. And then he turned to the desk. The desk was small and old, and made of cherry. It had a worn green leather inset on its top. Walter sat at it most evenings when he was not in the armchair. And he did at the desk a number of small things. The small bookkeeping of the shop. The writing of letters to dealers in Boston and New York and London. The cataloging of new arrivals. The slow, patient correspondence of a small bookman's life. Tonight he did not have any bookkeeping to do. The week had been settled on Wednesday. He had written all the letters he needed to write that morning. The new arrivals had been cataloged on Tuesday. The desk tonight was clear, except for the green-shaded lamp and the small pewter pen holder, and the small leather-bound notebook in which he sometimes wrote a few sentences before bed. Not a diary exactly, but a place where some thought of the day could be set down before it left him. He pulled the notebook a little closer, but he did not open it. He sat for a moment in the back room. The lamp was on. The fire in the stove was beginning to send a small warm light through the isinglass window in its door. The rain on the rear window of the shop, which looked out onto a small alley behind the building, made a soft, even sound. The shop, in this hour, had become, the way it became every evening, a small lit cave deep in a long, rainy October. Walter stood up. He went slowly into the middle room, and he began to walk the shelves. This was, every night, his small private ritual. He walked the shelves before he went upstairs. He went through the front room, through the middle room, through the back room, and he looked at the books. He did not look at all of them. He looked at the ones that, in some way, asked to be looked at on a given night. A title on a spine would catch his eye. A volume slightly out of place would catch his eye. The faded blue of a familiar binding would catch his eye. He would stop. He would draw the book out an inch or two, look at it, and slide it back. Sometimes he would open it for a moment, read a sentence at random, close it, and slide it back. He did not buy them again, did not need them, but he visited them. They had become, over 31 years, the people of his evenings. Tonight he stopped first in front of a small section in the middle room that held the New England regional writers, and he drew out, just to look at it, a small green cloth-bound volume of Robert Frost. He had owned this copy for many years. It had a small water stain on the back cover that he had always liked. He opened it at random and read 4 lines of "The Woodpile." He closed it. He slid it back. He moved on. A few feet further along, he stopped in front of a tall row of Sarah Orne Jewett. He had read all of her many years ago in a long winter when he had been laid up with a slight knee injury. And the books had a particular small association in his mind with that winter, with the long evenings of reading in the chair upstairs, with the bowl of soup on the side table, with the soft fall of snow on the roof. He did not draw any of the Jewett out tonight. He simply touched with 2 fingers the spine of "The Country of the Pointed Firs" in a small, light gesture, the way a man touches the lid of a jar to make sure it is closed. And he moved on. He came into the back room. In the glass case along the east wall, he had his small collection of older volumes. These were the books he sold when a serious collector came in, which was perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, and otherwise simply kept, because they were the kind of books he liked to know were in the building. He stopped in front of the case. He bent slightly to look at a small set of Dickens, the Charles Scribner's Sons edition from 1895, that he had bought at an auction in Boston in 1964. The bindings were the color of old burgundy. The spines had small gold lettering that had faded slightly at the tops. He liked them. They were not particularly rare or valuable. They were simply familiar. A few inches to the right of the Dickens, behind the same glass, was a slim brown leather volume of Whitman that he kept there mostly because he liked having it nearby. He did not open it tonight. He only looked at it through the glass, and he gave it the small private nod a man gives an old companion at a remove, and he turned away. He completed the round. He went back, slow, to the kitchen. He stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway and let his eyes go over the small, ordinary scene of it. The kitchen was perhaps 8 feet square. It had, on the wall opposite the door, a small window that looked out on the alley. It had, beneath the window, a deep porcelain sink in which he had set the teacup. It had a small wooden counter to the left of the sink, on which sat the kettle and the hot plate, and a small tin of tea bags, and a small pot of honey he kept for occasional sweetening. It had, on the right, a glass front cabinet of mismatched cups, perhaps a dozen of them that he had collected over the years. None of them matched. He liked them. The mismatching had become, over time, a small kind of choice. He filled the kettle from the tap. He set it on the hot plate. He turned the small knob to medium. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, looking at the kettle, listening to the rain. The kettle began, after a little time, to make its first small ticking sounds, the way a kettle does on a hot plate. He took down from the cabinet the same china cup he had used earlier in the afternoon, taking it out of the sink and rinsing it under the tap, because he was not going to let it sit dirty until the morning after all. He took, from the tin on the counter, a single tea bag, the strong black tea he drank in the evenings, and he placed it in the cup. He set the cup beside the kettle. He waited. He was not in a hurry. The rain made its long, even sound on the alley side of the building. A small drip from the gutter outside the kitchen window made a faint, regular tap on a pail he had set there a year ago and never moved. He had meant, when he set the pail, to move it after the storm that night had passed, and somehow the pail had become permanent. He had grown fond of the small tapping sound. He would not now move the pail. The kettle came to its boil. He poured. He watched the steam rise off the cup. He let the tea steep for the long minute he always let it steep. He removed the bag. He laid it in the saucer beside the cup, where it would cool, and where, in the morning, He would carry it to the small compost bucket he kept in the alley. He carried the cup slowly through the kitchen door, across the back room and to the door at the foot of the stairs to his apartment. He opened the door. The stairwell was narrow and the wood was old, and made the small particular sounds it always made when he climbed. The third step from the bottom always creaked. The seventh always creaked. The 10th gave a smaller, higher creak, almost a chirp. The 14th, near the top, made no sound at all, and he had often noticed that this was strange, but had never investigated. He climbed slowly, the way he climbed everything now. The teacup was warm in his hand. He held it carefully as one holds a candle in a long hallway. The apartment at the top of the stairs was small. It had a living room with 2 windows facing the street, a small bedroom, a smaller kitchenette, and a bathroom. The living room had a couch and a reading chair, both old, both his, and a small bookshelf along one wall, and a side table beside the reading chair, and a floor lamp that he had bought in the same year he had bought the rug downstairs. The walls had 3 framed prints on them, all of New England landscapes, all bought from the same dealer in Brattleboro over the years. There was no television. He had thought once or twice of getting a television and had not. There was a small radio on the kitchenette counter, and he listened to it sometimes on Sunday afternoons, when the public station played string quartets. But he did not have it on tonight. He set the cup on the side table beside the reading chair. He turned on the floor lamp. The room came up in its soft yellow light. He went slow to the small bedroom and changed out of his shirt and tie into the soft flannel shirt he wore in the evenings, the one with the small frayed patch at the right elbow that he had told himself for 2 years he would mend, and had not. He kept the trousers. He took off his shoes. He put on the wool slippers that had been a Christmas gift from his sister in Boston 6 winters ago, and that had, in those 6 winters, become his favorite indoor thing. He came back to the living room. He sat down in the reading chair. The chair greeted him, the way old chairs greet old sitters. It had a small, low creak as he settled into it that he had heard so many evenings he no longer really heard. He picked up the cup. He drank. The window beside the chair looked out onto the rear of the shop's roofline. The small slope of slate tiles going down to the gutter, and the lit edge of the alley below, where a single street lamp cast a small yellow circle into the rain. He could not see the rain itself in the dark, but he could see the small, constant disturbance of the puddle in the alley as the drops hit it. And he could see the slow run of water along the gutter. He sat. He drank. The cup was warm in his hands and warm in his chest. The cardigan was warm. The slippers were warm. The room was warm in the way that a small, low-ceilinged room above a heated shop is warm in October. Not very warm, but warmly enough. He let his head settle back against the high old upholstery of the chair. He thought for a small, slow while of nothing in particular. He thought perhaps of the small, ordinary fact that he had been doing this exact thing, in this exact chair, on perhaps 2,000 rainy October evenings over 31 years. There was not, in this fact, anything sad. The chair was a good chair. The tea was good tea. The rain on the slates above him was a good rain. He had become, over time, a connoisseur of his own small evenings. And the connoisseurship had a quality he could not have named when he was younger, but that he knew well now. He thought briefly of his sister Marjorie in Boston, who would, when she next wrote, ask him again to come for Thanksgiving. He would, when he next wrote her back, say that he could not leave the shop. They had had this same exchange, in writing, for many years. She would understand. She always did. They had understood each other in this way since they were children together in Worcester. He drank. After a time, he reached for the book he had set on the side table the night before. The book was a small old volume of Edward Thomas's poems, which he had been reading off and on for a week. It was not new to him. He had read it many times. He read it slowly, a few pages a night, and he was now somewhere in the middle. He opened it to the page he had marked with a thin slip of paper. He began to read. The poems were the slow, plain poems of Edward Thomas, who had been a quiet man who had lived in the English countryside, and who had walked mostly unnoticed, and who had died in France in 1917, At the age of 39, in the first hour of the first morning of the Battle of Arras, Walter had been not yet born when Thomas had died. The poems went on without him. They had a particular slow honesty to them that Walter had always liked. A kind of unwilling to perform quality. A willingness to mention the small actual things of the English countryside without making any large claim about them. There was a poem in this book about an old man chopping wood, and a poem about a kestrel, and a poem about the long, quiet rooms of an inn at evening. And Walter had read each of them many times over many years. He read. The poem on tonight's page was the one called Adelstroop, about a train stopping unexpectedly at a small English country station on a quiet summer afternoon in 1914, and the single moment of quiet that the poet had heard, and a blackbird, and the small, far calling back of other birds further on. Walter had loved this poem since he was 35. He read it again tonight. He read it slowly. The cadence of it was a cadence he knew well. He had it almost by memory, but he read it from the page anyway, because reading it from the page was part of the way he had come to know it. He read the way he had read all his life, with a slight inward lean, his eyes moving slowly down the page, his lips not moving but somewhere just inside his mouth, holding the small shapes of the words. He paused at lines he liked. He underlined nothing. He read. After the Adlestrop, he turned the page and read the next poem too, which was about a country lane and a particular small, slow afternoon. He read it. He let it pass through him. He turned more pages. He read for a long while. The rain went on outside. The lamp made its small, soft circle around the chair. He read until the cup of tea was empty. And the next cup of tea was something he could have made and did not bother to make. He read until the small green eye of his alarm clock in the bedroom said something a little after 8. He read until his eyes began to do the slow, heavy thing they did at the end of a long, quiet day. He marked the page with the small slip of paper. He closed the book. He set it on the side table beside the empty cup. He sat for a minute without moving. The book had been a friend tonight. The tea had been a friend. The chair was a friend. The rain on the slates above him was a friend. He stood up. His knees did the small popping thing they did these days. He smiled a little in the lamplight. He was 62. He had been 62 for some months. He did not mind. He took the empty cup to the kitchenette and set it in the small sink. He would wash it in the morning with the breakfast cup. He turned off the floor lamp in the living room. The room sank into the soft dim it sank into, lit only by the small thread of streetlight coming in through the window. And on the wall behind him, the slow, pale slip of headlight as one car somewhere down the rainy street passed along. He went slow to the bedroom. He undressed in the small, careful way he always undressed. He folded the trousers across the back of the chair by the dresser. He folded the flannel shirt across the trousers. He kept the union shirt and the wool socks. He went to the small bathroom and brushed his teeth in the slow, steady way he had brushed them every night of his adult life. 2 minutes by the small wooden clock on the shelf, top to bottom and front to back. He rinsed. He turned out the bathroom light. He came back to the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed. The bed had been his bed for 31 years. It was an old iron bedstead with a good firm mattress and a wool blanket folded twice at the foot. It greeted him the way old beds greet old sleepers, with a small, soft, yielding sound, and the memory of his shape. He turned the small lamp on the bedside table low. The room sank further. He picked up the small leather-bound notebook from the bedside table and the pen. He opened the notebook to a fresh line. He wrote, October the 20th, 1978. Rain all afternoon. Henry came for the Salinger. The book is selling itself. I think of Thomas tonight. The pail is still there in the alley. He closed the notebook. He set it back. He lay back on the bed and pulled the wool blanket up. The blanket was old and heavy and smelled very faintly of cedar from the chest where he kept it through the summer. He folded one arm behind his head. The other rested on his chest, where he could feel the slow rise and fall of his own breath. He closed his eyes. The rain on the slates above the shop went on in its long, even sound. The street lamp out in the alley made its small yellow circle. The shop below him, dark now. with its long rows of shelves and its many quiet thousands of books, and its small Persian rug and its old enamel stove cooling for the night, kept itself. He thought slowly of small things. He thought of Henry Caulfield, going home now with his Mencken and his Salinger, opening the books at his kitchen table in the next town over, perhaps with a glass of beer beside him, perhaps with his own wife in the next room. Henry had been married for almost 30 years. Walter did not know what kind of marriage it was, only that Henry seemed to be a man at ease in it. He thought of the small water stain on the back of his Robert Frost. He thought of the cup in the sink. He thought of the slow drip into the pail in the alley. He thought of Edward Thomas, walking a long time ago, somewhere in England, on some quiet country lane, on some long summer afternoon, before any of the world had changed. He thought of Adelstrop, the empty platform, the blackbird. He thought of the woman who had bought the beard and the child. He hoped her daughter would have a good marriage. He hoped the cookbooks would be opened often. He thought of the small Sarah Orne Jewett spine he had touched in the middle room with 2 fingers. He thought of Robidoux, who came every September to service the stove, and who told every September the same small set of stories about his sons, who had grown and moved away and who came back. Now, only for Christmas. His thoughts slowed. They became no longer thoughts, but only the gentle drift of one thing into another. The rain, the blanket, the slow rise and fall of his breath, the small, slow tick of the clock on the wall of the shop below him, which he could not hear from his bed, but which he knew was there, and which had been there since before him. He let it pass over him. He let it pass over him again. The rain went on, and the shop went on below him, and the long Vermont evening settled in around the building, and Walter, who was tired and warm and not afraid, drifted gently down into the deep, easy quiet of sleep. The rain kept falling. The street lamp kept its small yellow circle. The shop kept itself. And somewhere in the long quiet of the building, in the back room, the small wood stove that he had banked before going up sent up one last small gentle pulse of warmth. into the dark stacks of his books, and the books on their old wooden shelves settled into themselves for the night. The clock in the front room ticked. The clock in the back room ticked. The two clocks were not quite in step, and over the long course of the night they would drift in and out of each other's rhythm in the way they always did. Two slow, patient voices speaking past each other in the dark, and the rain on the roof of the shop would go on, and the small, steady drip into the pail in the alley would go on. And Walter, asleep in his bed above them all, would not hear any of it, and would not need to hear any of it, because the building was holding him, and the rain was holding the building, and the night was holding the rain, and he was a small-held thing inside a long-held thing inside a longer-held thing still. He slept. He dreamt briefly of a country lane in summer, of a stopped train, of a blackbird in a tree just out of sight. He turned in his sleep once, very slightly to the left. He settled. He slept on. The night kept being the night, and that was all. And now, a few quiet words to carry into sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The day is done. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. The room around you holds you gently. The bed beneath you holds you fully. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind may let go now. The long quiet is here. Sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet, sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet.